Welcome to the Semantics lecture. In this lecture we will talk more about semantics, how we make meaning, and how semantics also interacts with syntax or affects the syntax or sentence structure, sentence level grammar of language. We'll also talk about semantics and the lexicon. Lexicon refers to the words of a language. Not only the words that you know in a language or the words that exist in the language, but also grammatical information about the words. So when you know words like dog and table and hit and spike, you also know other information like how the words are pronounced, but what kinds of sentences they occur in, what kinds of verbs go with what kinds of nouns in sentences, and so on. And that kind of knowledge is your lexicon. It's your mental dictionary, which also includes additional information about how the word is used in sentences. That's your lexicon. So we'll talk about semantics and lexicon today. So semantics deals with meaning. And the question is, how do we make meaning? That has been a question of philosophy for a long time. And so a lot of traditional semantics came out of philosophy. How do we make meaning? How do words mean what they do? How do we understand words? What is it about words that allows us to communicate ideas and understand each other? Well, formal, traditional, philosophical semantics focused on certain questions. They focused on logic. They focused on truth conditions and the face value meaning of words, or what you might call the literal meanings of words. And that's important because philosophers want to talk about logic and logical arguments. And so if you say A and B and therefore C, for example, Socrates is a man, Socrates has two legs, therefore Socrates has two legs. Boring example, but they ask, okay, what is it about the meaning of the words and the sentences that makes us conclude that C, Socrates, has two legs because he's a man? So they looked at truth conditions, what are the required truth conditions for a statement to be logically true, and things like that. So let's look at classic examples of sentences that philosophers have looked at, or words. 1. The King of France is bald. Is that true or false? Well, it's actually false because now there is no King of France. It looks like it could be a true statement, but it's not true. It could be true if history had worked out differently. Hypothetically, yeah, there could still be a King of France, but there isn't. So it's not true, although you could imagine a different reality, a different world, as they say, where it could be true. Now let's take the next one. He is not married, therefore he is a bachelor. What is a bachelor? Well, they looked at meanings of words and how do you define the meanings in terms of maybe features that you could list. A bachelor is this and this and this. A bachelor is a male and he's not married. Is it true that an unmarried man necessarily is a bachelor, has to be bachelor? What about the Pope or a priest? Are those bachelors? Well, you would say no. So you need to add another feature to your list of features. A bachelor is a male who is not married and not available. Or what about a friend of mine who was not married but had a partner, but he couldn't marry because, well, my friend, an old friend of mine, was gay, is gay, and he couldn't marry just because the laws of his states didn't allow him to marry his partner until the laws changed and he was allowed to marry his partner. Was he a bachelor before he got married? Well, not really, because he had a partner. What about a guy who is not interested at all in getting married, who wants to stay single? Is that a bachelor? Well, you keep adding qualifications, new criteria to your list of features. A bachelor is this and this and this. And you could always come up with counterexamples that will frustrate any attempt to come up with a full list of features that define a bachelor. But nonetheless, they persisted in trying to work out this kind of a set theory approach. So think of set theory in math, where you have a set of things and it's defined by these characteristics, and all things with this characteristics belongs to the set. So bachelor's like a set, and it consists of these features: male, unmarried, available, interested, or willing to marry, and so on. So all males that meet those criteria belong to the set of bachelors. And while this often works for talking about the literal or face value meaning of words, it can run into problems. Some more examples: think about dog. What's a dog? Well, you can list features for dog: hairy, 4 legs, barks, tail. What about a dog that's lost its tail? What about a dog that's lost its legs in an accident? Is it still a dog? What about and it's for some reason been shaven? It's bald. Is it still a dog? Well, yeah, okay. What else? But so you have to keep adding features. Well, okay, it's got dog DNA. Well, what if you inject DNA from other animals into it? Is it still a dog? Well, up to a certain point, maybe. Well, what point? If you inject DNA and change its DNA so 10% of its DNA is different, or 5%, at what point does it cease to be a dog? Well, that's really hard to answer. And it seems like a theoretical debate, but it shows problems with the traditional approach of defining just lists and features. Nonetheless, this did have some interesting implications. Although this approach does have problems and shortcomings, this led to some implications for some of the grammar terms that we use. Because when we're talking about the King of France is bald, or unmarried bachelor, we talk about maybe possible worlds. Is there a possible world where there could be a King of France who is bald? Could be. You could think of that possibility. Is it possible to think of a world where a bachelor is married? No, you can't think of any possible world or reality where that's the case. By definition, a bachelor cannot be married. So they talked about modes of existence, or modality. So deontic is something that must necessarily be so, or maybe cannot be so. It must be the case that a bachelor is unmarried, and it cannot be the case that a bachelor is married. That's what we call deontic. It must be the case. There's epistemic, which is something we can know. We can know it, or it could be possible. It's possible that there could be a King of France in some alternate reality, and if so, that king could be bald. So that's in the realm of possibility. So things that exist, or things that are possible, that's kind of epistemic mode, and you can subdivide that into factual. The Prime Minister of England currently has ginger hair. That's a factual statement. A counterfactual, it's something that's not true, but it hypothetically could be true, that the next Prime Minister of England might have white hair. It's possible. So this modality actually shows up in the grammar and semantics of languages in a couple of ways. One, it shows up in modal verbs. Modal verbs, for example, like must and should, are deontic. You're talking about what must or should be so. And verbs like can, which talk about possibility or hypothetical realities. It also shows up in what's called verb mood or modality in some languages. So modality indicates the speaker's mood toward the statement, and it also indicates something about the modality, whether this is real or possible, or must be the case, or cannot exist. So indicative. In English, these are, this is a mood that's just indicated with regular garden variety function words, regular verbs and helping verbs, And an example is the Romans are going home, or they will go home, future tense. Romans did go home. Those are kind of factual statements about what happened, or is happening, or what will happen. That's indicative, factual statements. Then there's imperative, a command, Romans go home. So that is a modality you're demanding or commanding. Doesn't exist, but you're commanding it. Suggestive, let's go home. That's another kind of modality of verbs. And then there's what's called conditional or subjunctive. English has conditionals, would or could statements, for example, statements that are hypothetical or potential. Other languages have different verb forms in the inflectional morphology, and they may be called subjunctive, like Latin and German and Greek. So examples would be, if the Romans would leave, we would be free. If the Romans went home, we could invade England. So in English, it's called conditional. It's expressed with function words. And in Latin, for example, it's expressed with different verb inflections. There's also possibly optative. Ancient Greek had an optative for wishes, if only the Romans would go home. So, semantic or possible world modality is reflected in modal verb forms, modal verbs, and in verb mood, or things like indicative, imperative, conditional. So again, with modal verbs, we have deontic, should or must, for example, and then the epistemic or hypothetical can, could, will, would. What's the difference between must and should? If I say you must do your homework, I'm basically saying that's an obligation. Must literally is an obligation. You must do your homework. And if I tell you that, it's like I'm giving you a command. If I say you should do your homework, that's a little different. Should is more like strong advice or suggestion or expectation. You should do your homework. I'm communicating a strong expectation or suggestion. Now let's look at these statements. Think about whichever president you don't like. Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, Donald Trump, all have been guilty of lying. What's the difference in these statements? He is lying, he could be lying, he may be lying, might be lying, must be lying. The first one, he is lying, that's pretty easy. It's a factual statement, indicative. The last one, he must be lying, that's different. Must is usually deontic, indicating obligation, but that's not the meaning here, obviously. We're using it in a more epistemic sense. How do we know this? Well, it means I'm pretty certain. I don't know absolutely 100% for sure, but I'm pretty certain he must be lying. So it's an expression of certainty. Why? Because you're saying this must be the explanation. It must be the case that he is lying. And so we use must more metaphorically as an epistemic to indicate certainty. Now, he could be lying, may be lying, might be lying. What's the difference here? First, may is, well, native speakers will probably say that may is a bit more certain than might, but could is different. So think about, could originally was a past form of can, although the main meaning today in English is hypothetical. He could be lying, hypothetically. But think about can, you're talking about a person's ability or character. So if you say he could be lying, it means I don't trust the guy. He's capable of lying. Maybe he's lied before. It's within his nature or his character or his ability. I'm looking at the internal. I'm focusing on the internal, saying he internally is in his nature, character, or ability, or his history. He could be lying. But if I say he may be lying, he might be lying, I'm looking more at the situation. Things look suspicious, things look funny, he might be lying. So that's more external. So this is often just a slight nuance, a slight difference in nuance. Could is more internal, focusing on the subject, main, might, or more. External, focusing on the situation or the circumstances. And that's a distinction that may not exist in other languages. Okay, now back to the formal philosophical semantics. Let's look at some other possible definitions. We did in bachelor, dog. How about game? Can you think of a single definition for game? If you work on it, that's actually really hard. There are different kinds of games. There are sports games, or there are games that might be fun for one person, but very definitely not fun for another person when a mean person is playing cruel games with a victim, or you say, hey, stop playing games with, you say to your boyfriend or girlfriend, stop playing games with me, or stop playing games with our relationship. Board games, things you play at home in your room, is that okay? But what's the common feature? It's not always entertaining, it's not always fun, it's not necessarily an activity. You can think of some games that are not necessarily activities. It's almost impossible to come up with a good single definition that captures all things that we might call games in spoken English. It's practically undefinable. So that's a problem for traditional semantics. Another one is words like red. You could define red in terms of, its wavelengths, its frequency, but that's not a practical definition for the common person. What is red to you is probably red to me, but can I be sure that you see red the very same way that I do? Can you be sure that you experience red? When you look at something red, can you be sure that it is that you and I are experiencing the very same visual perception, the very same experience in our minds? No, we cannot. We cannot really be sure that your red, it looks exactly the same to you as it does to me. There's no way of really proving that it does. I can't get into your head and you can't get into my head. But we agree that it's red, but we can't be sure that our experience or perception are really the same. And this is what's called qualia, a property that is subjective and it cannot really be defined unless you use synonyms like red, it's between orange and yellow or something like that. But you can't really define it in a way that's objective. So that's a problem for traditional semantics. What about ground versus land? What's the difference? Well, ground is in contrast to sky or air. Land, traditionally in English, is in contrast to water, sea, ocean. So it's kind of a relational concept, sort of like how bachelor is sort of relational. It's defined in terms of relation, not married. So these are problems for traditional semantics. Now let's turn our attention to another semantic phenomenon. It's called grammaticalization, and this is something that newer approaches to semantics can explain that traditional semantics doesn't really handle so well. Sometimes a word can change in its lexical category. It's not often, but sometimes a content word can be used as a function word with a change in meaning. Often the meaning is kind of reduced or changed and used a bit metaphorically. Or sometimes a function word of one kind might start getting used as a different kind of function word. And this doesn't happen too often. These are function words, but it can happen. And there's a meaning change, and it's often described as a metaphorical or semantic change or extension. Part of the original meaning is extended to something new, and the rest of the original meaning is kind of lost or not used. For example, the modal auxiliary will, like I will go, originally came from a main verb, a lexical verb in Old English, to want or wish, wellan. Going to, so today it's like an immediate future tense. I'm going to go. Talking informally about something in the near future. This is something that came about in the past few centuries. Originally, well, it wasn't common to say that. You might say, I'm going to go shopping meaning specifically I'm going for the purpose of shopping. I'm going shopping. I'm going to buy something. I'm going to buy something. I'm going for the purpose of buying something. So originally, a few centuries ago, it was just a purpose phrase. Purpose. I'm going to buy in order to buy something. But this phrase got used enough in English, it became common enough that we started to apply it for something I'm going to do soon. I'm going to buy something. So you can see how the meaning transferred a little bit from the original sense of purpose. If you intend to do something, you're going to do it maybe soon for something kind of minor like shopping. So it's easy to see how this meaning can change into something for immediate future. So I'm going to buy something. Today it's not so much purpose usually, but it's an immediate future. I'm going to buy something. Another example is comment clauses. So in modern English, I think, that's cool, I think. That would be cool, I bet. That would be cool, you know. Those phrases are comment clauses. They no longer really have the full meaning of I and think. They're sort of used to manage the flow of information and the social relationships between speakers and listeners. It's more pragmatic, and they're not really used in the literal sense anymore. Another example is like. This is commonly used in the speech of younger people and often always older people. There is like a huge lizard in the bathroom. It's like, you know, I'm going to sleep in like all day long. And so like as a content word originally expressed similarity. And here it has become a kind of a discourse particle where there is a meaning of similarity. There is something like a huge lizard, or I'm going to sleep in like all day long. Maybe not literally, really all day long, but something kind of like that. It's a discourse marker, a discourse particle that functions to either emphasize or tone down the literal meaning of a statement to something maybe more figurative, or to emphasize something. There was like a huge lizard. It's also used as a quotative, meaning it reports what a person was thinking or saying. It was like, you can't really mean that. So in other words, my thinking was similar to this. You can't really mean that. I was like, you can't really mean that. That's a quotative. So the idea of similarity has been reduced to use as a quotative or as a discourse marker. And that's an example of grammaticalization. Another example of grammaticalization, preposition and phrasal verb particles. So English has a lot of prepositions and phrasal verb particles. So a phrasal verb is something like fell over, or it's over, or turn the radio on. You can say turn on the radio, turn the radio on. Sometimes you can move them, and they're phrasal verb particles. So these are originally prepositions, but now they're used as phrasal verbs. And sometimes it's hard to tell the difference. But for us here, it doesn't matter, because what matters is semantically they are similar. These prepositions originally have a literal or spatial meaning. So for example, over has original spatial meaning of movement from one point over a reference point to another point, like on the other side, or being a position above, looking over a reference point, like that dot in the diagram. And that's the spatial, physical meaning of over. From that we can derive other spatial meanings, like to fall over, which is a falling down motion, but it's different from down, which is straight down. Falling over, it's a little different. It's kind of falling down at an angle, and it may sound more descriptive. The new tower looks over the farm fields, being in a higher position, standing over me. This can also be extended to somewhat metaphorical expressions, and in fact a lot of times these prepositions and phrasal verbs have metaphorical meanings, and that's why they're hard to learn for someone learning English as a second language, because of all the metaphorical meanings involved. I'm over a company of 5,000 employees. I'm I preside over a great empire. It has a metaphorical meaning of dominance, control, power, authority. The invaders are taking over our country, control. So over has this kind of metaphorical meaning. And it comes from the idea of being physically over on top of something. Dominance, control. From the idea of transition from one side to another, you can get meanings like physical meanings like this. Physical or quasi-physical meanings like he asked his classmates over to his apartment. We had to pull over to the side of the road. It's like sideward motion. So it's kind of like an over motion, but it's now sideways. And it's maybe not in a straight line or takes some effort. So pull over, come over. From this kind of transition motion from one side to another, we get other meanings. The Han River freezes over during extremely cold winter storms. The sky quickly clouded over. So the metaphor here is covering, movement from one side to another, and thus covering something. Covering. Another similar meaning, metaphorical meaning, is transition. We will change over to a new system. He won over her heart. Transition, change. From the idea of going from one side to another and finishing something, you have completion, a time event. The semester is over. I got over a cold. Completion, recovery. There's also from the idea of completion, you can extend it and you can go back again and go repeatedly. So there's the idea of repetition and careful, deliberate process. We need to think over the problem. We need to go over the data, go over the plan. Looking at over from a different vantage point, you can think of excess. This stew pot boiled over. We have food left over. And so that from that we get a metaphor of excess. Quantum physics is over my head. Yeah, I mean over my head, excess. We get the idea of repetition again from finishing something. We have to do it over. Up works in a similar way. You can look at up as movement from one point upward and from two different vantage points, A and B. So from A's vantage point, you think of something rising, increasing. Prices went up, increase. And we get other metaphorical meanings. Improvement, things are looking up. Support, protection, back up your data. Completing an action and the degree of completion. I'll wait up to 20 minutes. Completing or interrupting an action, interruption. So wake up, drink up. And for this reason, shut up is very rude because you're demanding the person finish and interrupt what they're saying right now. Shut up. I'm fed up with your nonsense. Excessive amount, completion, degree of completion. From B's point of view, there's something coming into view, appearance. So appearance, including sudden or unexpected appearance. Look who turned up. Something came up. Zip up, joining together. Zip up, creating or making something that was made up. I dreamed up something. We drew up a plan. We made up a plan. Those are all metaphorical extensions from the physical meaning of up. So, prepositions and phrasal verbs, phrasal verb particles in English are often metaphorical. And that's the tricky thing. Prepositions tend to be used metaphorically in different languages. Traditional semantics does not explain this very well. The approach that we're using here is called cognitive semantics, where there's a core physical meaning for things like up and over, but they can be extended in other ways. They can be extended to other spatial meanings like to fall over. They can be extended to temporal or time meanings like the semester is over. It's almost over. Temporal, time expressions. Time is up. And then a lot of metaphorical meanings come out of all of these spatial and temporal meanings. I'm fed up, shut up, I'm over you, things like that. Lots of metaphorical meanings. And that's really tricky. There are about maybe more than 10,000 phrasal verbs in English. We can make up more on the fly whenever we need a new expression. It's very productive. We can make more whenever we need to. And all the metaphorical meanings can be confusing to learners of English. So, to sum up, limits of traditional formal semantics, compositionality. So our daily poll question was things like the sentence is false. Is that sentence, the whole sentence, false or true? It's a logical paradox. Colorless green ideas sleep furiously. Chomsky used this. It's a famous sentence from Chomsky to show that a sentence can be perfectly grammatical but make no sense, and that grammar and semantics are distinct. How do you get meaning? So compositionality means the meaning of the whole, like a phrase or sentence, is the sum of the parts. You can sum up the meanings of a whole, of all the words in a sentence to get the meaning of the whole sentence. And to some degree that works, but not always, as these interesting odd sentences show. It doesn't always work. There are feature-based approaches. Okay, what's a table? Does it have 4 legs? Well, I can imagine a table with 3 legs, 2 legs, 1 legs. What about a table with no legs? What if it's floating or suspended by strings? Well, it depends. It's suspended by strings from the ceiling. Is it still a table? Maybe if you're using it for a table. What's a bird? Well, you think of things that have 2 wings and sing, like magpies and sparrows and ducks, or they quack. But what about penguins? Well, yeah, they're birds, but they don't fly. What about kiwis and ostriches? Are those birds? Well, yeah, but they're really not typical birds. They're really on the edge of the bird category. They're weird examples. How do you define? So it's really hard to come up with a list of features for birds when you've got weird things like penguins, kiwis, and ostriches. They don't fit the traditional list of features for birds. What's a game? It's really hard to come up with a list of features that really describe all games. Probably impossible. Qualia are really hard to define. They defy definition other than subjective descriptions. Relational meanings like land and ground, it's really hard to come up with traditional features that are defined in terms of contrast, what they are not. Another problem for traditional semantics is reference. It was assumed that one noun referred to one thing, and if you have a different noun, it refers to something else. But then the morning star, the evening star, Venus, those all refer to the same thing. They all have the same referent, and that's kind of tricky for traditional semantics. Feature-based approaches in set theory, as we explained, coming up with a list of features for the set of all things that are considered dogs or tables or birds or games, don't necessarily work that well. They defy sometimes clear definition based on just features or belonging to a particular set of things. So in our next lecture, we will look at an alternative approach to semantics called cognitive semantics. We saw a bit of that with grammaticalization and with phrasal verbs and prepositions. We'll see more of that next time and how that can explain meanings of some things better. So, see you next time.